Hello, I'm Christopher Wynne.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
A podcast about the life, the world and the legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith. I made my debut with a piece of writing called On Flinders Face. It was the tale of a man going mountain climbing with two friends, one of whom had been cuckolding the other by sleeping with his wife. In the months before writing it, I had myself discovered rock climbing with a group of friends. On the weekends, we would head out into the veldt around Salisbury and scale the granite kopjes which are so typical of the landscape there. I had had my share of close scrapes on the ranch where I'd grown up, but this was a different challenge, and a daunting introduction to a world of terror-infused adrenaline that I had not quite anticipated. The cliff faces of Rhodesia's heartland were sheer and smooth, offering few handholds even for a seasoned climber. But I had given myself to them with gusto, displaying a confidence to which I had no real claim. Soon my confidence got the better of me. I reached too far, committed myself too early, and the granite slipped out of my grasp. One petrified instant later, I was plunging downwards, the cliff face rushing into the sky, the whole world a blur of colour and churning air. I fell for what seemed like an age, but it could only have been seconds, and suddenly I was swinging helplessly from the end of my rope, several 100 feet above the ground. As I dangled there, reflecting on how easily lives could end, the plot of On Flinders Face flowed into my mind. It was a moment of pure inspiration, in which story and characters simply materialised in front of my eyes. I knew that if I survived, I would have to write it down. This was a story and a world that I understood. I was living it, every heartbeat of the moment, after all. I knew about the terror and thrill of rock climbing from personal experience. I knew how the hard granite felt beneath a climber's fingers, how the challenge of pitting yourself against a mountain could come to dominate the mind. And now I had first-hand knowledge of the fear all mountaineers, professional or amateur, will one day come to know, the sensation of freefall as the mountain betrays you at last. That was from Wilbur's autobiography on Leopard Rock, talking about the experience he had that led to his first published work, a short story called On Flinders Face. And the insight, he goes on to talk about the insight that he gained from it in terms of really understanding that you had to write from personal experience to really be able to conjure up that atmosphere, and also for him to feel the magic of the story he was telling. And in this episode, we're going to be paying homage to that a bit by looking back on some of the things we've learned from our experiences on the podcast so far.
Yes, of course, Wilbur was famous for his ability to blend his characters and adventures into real-life historic situations and places in such a way that you were sort of drawn into wanting to know more. And in order to learn more, we invited onto the last series a series of guests who were experts on the historic subjects and events and places that Wilbur put in his books. We began by asking them, what did they think of historical fiction? And this is what the fabulous Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher said about coming to history through reading fiction.
The bigger picture is that, look, does this bring people into the world of ancient Egypt? Does it make them want to know more? Does it make them want to read fact books? Does it make them want to maybe visit their local museum? Does it make them want to go on holiday to Egypt? And the answer is quite often yes. So bring it on. I just think that's a wonderful thing.
And this ties in very much with something that we talked about in Series 1 with Saul David, the historian who'd written both fiction and nonfiction about the Zulu War, when we asked him if Wilbur's work had been an influence on him.
It was. I think it was probably the first time I read any account of the Battle of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, the twin battles, as we'll no doubt discuss, taking place on the same day. When I was 16 at boarding school in Yorkshire, it was all the rage to read Wilbur Smith, and we piled through as many books as we could. But of course, the story set in the Zulu War had enormous influence on me.
And that's so true. And I think probably, certainly I and most of our listeners will have the experience that a really well-written historical novel can encourage the reader to really want to learn more about the historical events and eras in the story, and maybe go on to tell stories of their own. Certainly, that was true of me. I grew up reading historical fiction, and that inspired me to become the historical novelist I became. And again, looking at Wilbur's life, he was reading things like H. Rider Haggard, King Solomon's Mines, at an early age, and being really inspired to become the writer that he became. Of course, he was one of the greatest writers of historical fiction of all time, and is an absolute genius at making historical events and eras come alive. You really lose count of the number of people you meet who say they've inspired to either go somewhere or learn about something by reading a Wilbur Smith book.
Yeah, well, actually, yes, I'm one of them. And a bit like Saul David, it was through reading When the Lion Feeds that I first heard about, or learned about, the Battle of Isandlwana. And I was keen to learn more about it from Saul. Tom, you started by asking him about the Zulus' tactics at Isandlwana.
So the tactics that were used by the Zulus at the Battle of Isandlwana were very similar to Shaka's tactics, which is the horns of the buffalo. The famous horns of the buffalo, you have the chest, which goes up against the main enemy force, and then you have these two wings, the horns, which surround the enemy. And the reason this tactic is significant is because it means that the enemy are now trapped within, if you've executed this maneuver properly, they're now trapped in this noose, I suppose you'd call it. The main chest of the Zulu army, 20,000 strong, comes up against the main defenses of the camp. Meanwhile, the two horns of the buffaloes are racing all the way around the camp. Now, for a brief time, the gunfire, in particular of the horsed men defending the camp, Durnford's horsemen, stops one of the horns, but eventually they get overwhelmed, driven back into the camp, and the camp is completely surrounded. It's then hand-to-hand fighting, which of course is what the Zulus excel at, using their stabbing spears. And every single man who doesn't manage to escape from the camp, and that's 1,350 of them, are killed. Most of them then have their stomachs opened, which is why it's such a charnel house, such a brutal scene to see for those who come afterwards.
Yeah. There's a wonderful description in When the Lion Feeds of Sean Courtney finding his father Wait dead halfway up the mountain as he's retreated up in the sort of final pocket of resistance to the Zulus, which illustrates the way that Wilbur so brilliantly inserted his characters into real historical events.
Sean and his companion came to the English lines. Sean gagged when he saw what had been done to them. They lay piled upon each other, faces already black, and each one of them had been disemboweled. The flies crawled in their empty stomach cavities. He walked on heavily past the wagons. The smell of putrefaction was so thick that it coated his throat and tongue like castor oil. "I must find Pa." Sean spoke quietly, in almost a conversational tone. They came to the lines where the volunteers had camped. The first of the Ladybird men lay just beyond. They lay in a rough circle facing outwards. And then he found a sparse trail of corpses leading up towards the shoulder of the mountain. He followed the attempt that the volunteers had made to fight their way back towards the Tugela. He climbed on up, and at the top of the rock shoulder, close under the sheer rock cliff, he found his father.
Again, so it was an incredibly vivid image of almost like, the tide rising up the mountain, and they're retreating until they can go no further, and they're cornered. Again, is that historically accurate, that people kind of retreat up this mountain trying to find safety?
It is, and he's based that sequence of events really on the retreat of Durnford. I mentioned Durnford once before. Durnford was used actually as the scapegoat for the defeat at Isandlwana by Chelmsford. Chelmsford insisted that Durnford was given orders to stay and defend the camp. Not true, as we discovered, that is, historians later discovered the actual order, and it never said anything about taking command of the camp. It just ordered him and his horsemen to come towards the camp. And it was Durnford who, as I've already pointed out, managed to prevent one of the horns from getting fully surrounding the camp for a considerable period of time, they did have a little bit of trouble with ammunition, actually, not so much the British infantrymen, but Durnford's men, and they withdrew. So under Durnford's command were a lot of white settlers, which is where the Sean Courtney's father bit comes into the story, or at least, that you could say, well, he's part of one of those rough riding groups. And all of that is true. And so Durnford is generally considered to have led the last stand. And they went further and further and further up the mountain. Although interestingly, it's not. They didn't go up the mountain of Isla Muana itself, mainly because it's incredibly steep and it would have been difficult to have negotiated it. What they did is they manoeuvred up to the top of something called the Stony Kopje, which was another bit of high ground directly opposite the actual mountain of Isla Muana, or the hill of Isla Muana, and in between is the famous saddle over which a number of Europeans fled to get away, and also finally where the Zulu impis, the two horns of the buffalo, met when they finally surrounded the camp. So all of that is absolutely true, and he has based that on historical fact, that withdrawal of Durnford and his horsemen to the Stony Kopje, where all of them perished.
Yeah, well, I didn't realise it's quite that historically close to fact.
We then moved on to a description of the battlefield and the visually striking mountain that overlooks it.
So the Zulus have overwhelmed the camp. I think we've not described probably the most visually striking feature of this battlefield, which is the actual mountain of Isandlwana itself. Because it's described as a mountain in Wilbur's book. I think it's more of it's like a sort of a rock. It's a kopje, isn't it? Effectively,
yeah. It's relatively small, sort of 500 feet high, but it's very distinctive. It's set in kind of rolling plains. Anyone who's seen the setting, is incredibly beautiful landscape, actually, with lots of little hidden valleys all over the place. But this Sphinx-like, it's described as a sphinx, and when you see pictures of it, you can see why they felt it was Sphinx-like. And it's ironic, actually, that the emblem of the regiment that fought and died at Isla Muana is a sphinx, because they had got that battle honor fighting in Egypt in 1800, and it was almost as though they were fated eventually to meet their maker, as it were, at this extraordinary mountain. But one of the reasons that they chose to camp in its lee, really, is because it was so distinctive. It was a kind of a point that you could say, well, this is where we are, but it also there was plenty of firewood and also water in the vicinity, and it made a perfect camping ground.
It's interesting, Chris, that you said that you'd never heard of the Battle of Isandlwana. It does actually feature in the movie Zulu, but only at the very beginning. And I suspect people tend to forget that bit. You see images of British soldiers' bodies strewn across this battlefield, while Richard Burton reads a gloomy dispatch from the British commander. But of course, nobody remembers that bit. They all remember Michael Caine and the heroic defence of Rorke's Drift that follows. And something similar has happened in the historical memory, really, that probably most of the British nation has forgotten about Isandlwana, because it's a massive defeat, one of the worst for its scale in British history. While Rorke's Drift was played up as a heroic last stand to kind of distract from the defeat at Isandlwana.
I must admit I had forgotten those scenes from the beginning of the film Zulu. And you're absolutely right. The British government was desperate to distract the public's attention from the disastrous defeat at Isandlwana to the slightly less disastrous victory, as it were, at Rorke's Drift. And that slightly better news was very much needed at the time.
As you've sort of suggested, it was needed. It was very much needed. These two battles took place on the same day. One was an utter disaster that compares with anything, any military disaster in British military history, actually, but certainly in the Victorian period. And the shock to the system for the British public was such that they were absolutely looking out for anything that could kind of leaven the effect of that and still make them feel a little bit good about themselves, about a British feat of arms. So Rorke's Drift was incredibly fortuitous, but it was undoubtedly exaggerated both by the commanders in South Africa and also by the politicians at home, again, to deflect from their responsibility for what had been frankly a war of aggression, and a war of aggression that had started very badly with this humiliating defeat. So There's one particularly telling quote from Chelmsford where he writes to one of the officers who's writing the report of Rorke's Drift and says, please tell me it's finished, because I'm desperate to send that little gleam of sunshine, as he described it in his letter, as at home as quickly as possible. And of course, waiting back home was Disraeli, the Prime Minister, or Lord Beaconsfield as he had become, who also was looking to get some good news to deflect the political sort of, fallout from the defeat. So he was desperate to get that news, and they were trumpeting it in Parliament and exaggerating, as I've already suggested, by saying it effectively saves Natal, when that simply wasn't the case.
I'd never actually realised that Nsandlwana and Rorke's Drift were on the same day.
It is extraordinary how the Zulus managed to fight that huge battle, absolutely destroy a British army, and then go on and try and do it all over again a second time in the same day. I think it's a sort of testament to the warrior spirit and just the strength of the Zulu nation and their army.
Well, the distance between the two battlefields was 11 miles, and there's one crucial component of the Zulu army, the Zulu Impi, that is not involved in the Battle of Islamwana because it's not required, and that is the reserve. So, in effect, every Zulu army has a chest, two horns of the buffaloes, and the loins, or reserve as it's known. And of course, you bring in the reserve in an emergency if you haven't managed to break through and beat your enemy with the first three elements. Well, they had managed to do that at Islamwana. So the reserve is left having not fought anyone, and they're pretty keen to get into the fray. And they hear word that there is a mission station just across the Natal border over the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift, where indeed Chelmsford's army has come from in the first place, and that this is easy pickings. It's effectively a supply station. There'll be grain, there'll be ammunition, other things that the Zulus can get their hands on. It will, in effect, be an invasion of Natal, but only briefly. That's the plan. So you get across the river, you take the mission station, you sack it, you kill anyone defending it, and then you move off. So that's pretty much what was going on. There were no specific orders, certainly not from Chichwaya, the king, to cross into Natal. And he says after the campaign is all over, and the Zulus, of course, have been defeated, that, this was a big mistake, and he never gave those orders. So it's the individual commander in charge of the reserve of the Zulu army who decides to attack Rorke's Drift.
Of course, as I mentioned, one of the reasons we know all about Rorke's Drift is from the movie Zulu, starring Michael Caine and I think it was Jack Hawkins, which came out in 1964, which was indeed the same year as When the Lion Feeds came out. And Michael Caine and Wilbur have a bit of history together.
Well, not history exactly, but certainly their lives have certain parallels. Both were born in 1933, Wilbur in January, Michael Caine in March.
Okay.
Both got their big break in 1964, Michael Caine with the film Zulu, which was about Rorke's Drift, and Wilbur with his first blockbuster, When the Lion Feeds, which features scenes from Rorke's Drift with Garrett Courtney. Wilbur, of course, went on to become one of the greatest adventure writers of his time, while Michael Caine went on to become one of the greatest movie stars of his time from that moment. And it was, I guess, sort of inevitable they should eventually meet. And there's a wonderful photo on Wilbur's Facebook page of Wilbur and Michael Caine meeting at Annabelle's at a book launch in 2016. Both of them, it has to be said, looking suitably starstruck. And apparently after Wilbur had left, Michael Caine was overheard to say to his wife, "I can't believe that was Wilbur Smith. What a bloody great writer he is." Which of course, I hope Michael Caine will forgive me for that, but of course it echoes his famous phrase, "You were only supposed to blow the bloody doors off." And it sort of comes full circle, because Michael Caine recently himself became an adventure writer,
yes.
With a book called Deadly Game, which came out last year.
Yes.
It's actually a damn good read and very much in the Wilbur genre. So I'd like to think that maybe Michael Caine was picking up vibes from Wilbur throughout his career.
You'd have to think so, wouldn't you? Yeah. So Rorke's Drift and Nsandlwana featured in When the Lion Feeds, which was Wilbur's first book that kick-started his first great saga of the Courtney family. Later in the podcast series, we turned our attention to another one of his epic sequences of novels, this time set at 4,000-ish years earlier in the world of ancient Egypt. And to illuminate that world, we had another fabulous guest, the wonderful Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher from York University, who gave us incredible insights into ancient Egypt.
Now, River God, of course, is set against the real-life struggle between the native Egyptians of Upper Egypt and the invaders of Lower Egypt, who were the Hyksos. And the Hyksos held the upper hand over the Egyptians because they had three things the Egyptians had never come across before: horses, chariots, and the wheel. Extraordinary enough. And one of the things we learned from Joanne was the answer to the riddle that had puzzled us for really quite some time, the real reason why the Egyptians didn't have the wheel, a conundrum that Tom put to her.
We've talked a couple of times about the chariots and the horses. And first of all, in the book, in River God, not only have they never seen a chariot before, but they've never seen the wheel before. And they've also never seen horses before. And this is, as you say, this is a trading civilization. They're going all around the Levant. They've got stuff coming in from as far away as Afghanistan, probably, in terms of like the lapis lazuli and so on. So how on earth, first of all, is this correct that they've never seen these things? And second of all, if so, how have they never managed to come across these things in all their travels?
Well, certainly chariots were new to them. The idea of a very lightweight vehicle on two wheels that could zoom about at the speeds that we're talking about. However, the wheel did exist in ancient Egypt. Some recent research has said as early as the Pyramid Age. So certainly by 2300 BC, they were aware of wheels. We have wheeled vehicles used in Egypt in limited numbers, probably by the Second Intermediate period already, but these were mainly for transport. But as I said, it's a very limited usage because in Egypt, your main superhighway is the River Nile to get from A to B. It's a very linear sort of land, obviously, because transport was mainly up and down the river by boat, because either side of this, you've got largely a desert landscape. You've got the muddy banks of the Nile, then you've got a rocky desert landscape of stone and sand. And so to use the wheel is not particularly practical, not particularly efficient. And so it from a practical point of view, but sure, the Egyptians knew of the wheel, but not necessarily saw a particular need to utilize it in daily life.
Another thing we learned from Joanne, which we both rather liked, was that the reputation that redheads have of being fiery and turbulent and hot-tempered actually comes from the ancient Egyptians. And all this stemmed from a conversation we had with Joanne about a picture from Herculaneum, showing Cleopatra with red hair. And since Joanne has red hair herself, is a great fan of Cleopatra, she was very much all for this. But anyway, as I say, here's what Joanne had to say about the ancient Egyptians and redheads.
Yeah, something integral to the Hyksos is that the Egyptians often portrayed people from the Levant, from the Eastern Mediterranean seaboard area with red hair. And they made a great play of that. And it's interesting that the male god that the Hyksos worshipped in Egypt, they worshipped Egyptian gods like the sun god Ra, but they also worshipped their own version of Baal, the Middle Eastern god of storms, who in Egypt is Seth. And Seth in Egyptian mythology is traditionally shown with red hair. And after the Hyksos period had ended, the Egyptians who took over would always refer to turbulent people. I'm not saying trouble causers, but people who were quite volatile and turbulent as the red-headed forms, the followers of Seth. And that was fair enough until the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Ramses II and his father Seti, took power after the fall of the house of Tutankhamun. They took power, and lo and behold, they were redheads. And so, isn't it interesting that Seth, this turbulent god, this red creature, was suddenly rehabilitated within the Egyptian pantheon? He was suddenly seen as one of the good guys. Oh, yes, he's a defender of the sun god. We've loved Seth all along. And certainly we've got Ramses II as an older pharaoh when the red hair of his youth was fading, actually using henna. Tests have been done on his hair, and his hairdressers were actually augmenting the colour with red henna dye, just to sort of keep his trademark red hair going. And again, it's this little window into this world of, this aging pharaoh. You see him sat there with his hairdressers, putting the dye on, touching up his roots. Love it. Absolutely love it.
Of course, redheads appear throughout Wilbur's works in some very memorable characters, including Dorian Courtney, whose red hair is taken as a sign that he's fulfilling a prophecy in Monsoon, and also Zuga Ballantyne, who's one of the main characters of A Falcon Flies, which was another novel that we looked at in the last series of the podcast. And one of the elements of Falcon Flies is the protagonists come upon the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, which was something that we wanted to find out more about. So we enlisted the help of the South African expert Joost Fonteyn.
Yes, and we began by reading him Wilbur's description of his first visit to the Great Zimbabwe from his autobiography on Leopard Rock.
We had come to the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, once a city in the southeastern hills of Zimbabwe near Lake Mutirikwe and the town of Masvingo. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe during the country's late Iron Age, the largest of many hundreds of smaller ruins, now known as Zimbabwe's, spread across what was then Rhodesia's Highveld. We had arrived as the sun was setting because my mother was fascinated by the ancient world. My father led the way. The ruins stretched for miles, the hills crowned by what had once been small towers. But here, in the heart of the ancient city, there was only one great edifice, a fortress built from stones of magnificent size. We passed along overgrown passages between tumble-down walls, through a great enclosure where the air was curiously still. Archaeologists and anthropologists would spend their careers debating what kind of civilization had been centered on these ruins. Some reckon the city was between 500 and 1,000 years old, and that war, famine, pestilence, or natural disaster had befallen its people and laid the city to waste. Nothing was certain. So the first thing we wanted to ask Joost was, is that an accurate description of Great Zimbabwe?
Well, Great Zimbabwe is, it's no longer known as ruins, but it's a collection of ruins of a medieval city, which, there are debates about when it existed, but when it thrived is conventionally known as somewhere between the 11th and the 15th centuries, although recent debates argue that it's actually been continually occupied from around that time till the 20th century, actually, and that's an ongoing debate. It's Great Zimbabwe is interesting not only because it's a magnificent place, and anybody who's ever been there will recognize that, and I think the description read to us captures some of that. But it's also amazing because it's a brilliant example of African achievement. So for all of those reasons, it's an amazing place to go to and definitely worth visiting.
And of course, it's actually so central that it actually gives its name to the country of Zimbabwe, which had formerly been the colony of Rhodesia.
Yes, what does Zimbabwe mean?
It comes from two words, Zimbabwe. Zimba is the plural for house, so houses, and za is the prefix of, and mabwe is stones. So it's actually three words. It's two words, but there's a prefix. So houses of stone.
Of course, another major theme and plot point of A Falcon Flies is the slave trade. And Robin Ballantyne's motivation through a lot of the book is actually to stamp out the slave trade, which has already been declared illegal by the time the novel's set in 1860, but persists in secret ways and perpetuated by people who are willing to take great risks in running the British blockade to get the slaves to the markets in South America and indeed still in America. Personified by the absolutely unforgettable character of Mungo St. John as the slaver, and in his rival for both power and for Robin's affections, Clinton Codrington, the Royal Navy captain commanding the ship that's running the anti-slavery patrols. And the abolition of slavery was a topic we looked at in a lot of depth with the great writer Adam Hochschild, who had written a book all about how the slave trade came to be abolished in Britain.
Yes, he was a fascinating character. He'd worked in the civil rights movement in the southern states of America in the 1960s, which, of course, I guess is why he became interested in slavery in the first place. And he told us how exhilarating it was to be able to write a book about abolishing slavery and how that movement had developed so many of the methods of campaigning that we still use today.
but also things like the civil rights movement, mass movements, and the sort of raising the awareness and raising consciousness of social injustices. All of these sort of find their roots in the slave trade and opposition to it.
At the same time, I have to say the experience of writing this book was exhilarating in learning about this extraordinary movement and devised so many techniques we use today. You know, the very idea of a national organization with a headquarters in a country's capital with branches in towns and cities all over the country. There had never been anything quite like this in Britain before. The idea of people from, in a very deeply religious age, of people from several different religious sects, primarily Quakers and Anglicans, and later on some Baptists and Methodists, coming together to work for a secular aim. Again, almost unheard of. The techniques they devised, they created the first logo I know of anywhere. The image of a kneeling slave in chains, surrounded by the legend, "Am I not a man and a brother?" When women got active a couple of decades later, theirs was a woman slave in chains, surrounded by the legend, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" They created the world's first political poster, and you know, you've all seen it, that image of the sort of top-down diagram of a slave ship with their bodies just lined up in rows like sardines. That was done by a local anti-slavery committee in Portsmouth. And as soon as the committee in London saw this, they thought, wow, that's a powerful piece. They ran off 8,000 copies. They sent a batch to their friend and ally, Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, to another friend, Marquis de Lafayette in Paris, and they put them up in pubs all over England. So it was just exhilarating to learn about these techniques being invented, tried, and used successfully. Another thing that's been sort of exhilarating in the aftermath of this book is to hear from so many people involved in different kinds of organizing for justice movements today who are inspired by this story. I feel such pleasure in having, I got a lovely letter, for example, from the woman, Jody, I can't remember her last name, who won or co-won the Nobel Prize for starting this worldwide movement against landmines. She said, in effect, thank you for introducing me to some of my counterparts from several centuries ago.
That was Jody Williams, the American lady he was talking about,
Yeah.
who began the movement against landmines. Anyway, Adam was also very interesting about why the mood in Britain suddenly changed with regard to the slave trade. What had changed people's opinion of it from what had been seen as simply a commercial enterprise where everyone was making lots of money, and then suddenly it was seen as a horrific, evil trade.
I think there were a number of things going on. First, there was a lot of talk in the air about human rights and freedom. This was in the period between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, those few years. And remember, there were many people in Britain, by some estimates, again, you can only estimate this, maybe a third of the population, who felt, you know, if those American colonists want to govern themselves, why shouldn't they? Who were sympathetic to what, you know, the American effort to break free. So those ideas were in the air. And I think also you have to give credit to this remarkable movement, which found a way to talk about this that hadn't been discovered before. And that was talking about it through vivid eyewitness testimony. Obviously, for decades, there had been debate in Britain about slavery, and there'd been people writing pamphlets and articles in newspapers and so on, but it was always done in terms of the Bible. For the first time, the anti-slavery committee that had gotten formed in May 1787, they began to see the power of eyewitness testimony. Clarkson, the spark plug of this committee, and we should talk about him, got Reverend John Newton to write a pamphlet about his experiences being on a slave ship, what it was like. Got Alexander Falconbridge, who had been a slave ship doctor, to write a short book about his experiences. Got people to testify before the House of Commons, before the House of Lords, before committees of them, about what life was like on slave ships and plantations. So suddenly all this eyewitness testimony was floating around. I call it, this was, really the first great wave of investigative journalism.
Yeah. Still thinking about Falcon Flies, another key element of the book, one might almost call it a character in the book, is the Zambezi River. Wilbur famously was fascinated by the great rivers of Africa, and they don't come much greater than the Zambezi, or at least they didn't. And to tell us all about it, we had an amazing guest, Marlyn Newitt, who had actually written a history of the Zambezi River, which he had written in lockdown from memory, from the many trips he'd taken over the years to visit it.
Yes, and we read him a passage from A Falcon Flies, Wilbur's description of the Zambezi Delta, which Marlyn said, rather alarmingly, would not be recognisable to Wilbur today.
It was interesting to hear that reading of Wilbur Smith's description of the Delta, because the major changes are now taking place as a result of the building of dams. The first dam was the Kariba Dam, which was built in the 1950s. Then there was the Kaborabassa Dam, which was completed in 1974. And these dams, between them, created huge lakes, 200 miles in length, and turned the central areas of the Zambezi, in effect, into two huge lakes, no longer a flowing river, but two huge lakes. Now, these dams were built to generate electricity, almost entirely for, or largely for South Africa, although the Kariba Dam was also supplying the two Rhodesias. But once in the 2010s, climate change did begin to affect the rainfall in the area. Now, nobody knows if this is a unique event or if it's a recurring feature, because there's quite a lot in my book and also in the research about the periodic droughts that affected this part of Africa. And I particularly describe the great drought of the 1820s, when all the sort of streams dried up and the river fell and so on. But at the height of the drought in the 2010s, the Zambezi ceased to flow over the Victoria Falls. And if you go onto the internet and look for the Victoria Falls, the year 2019, you'll see that there was no water at all going over the falls. It's a terrifying picture.
That actually is a terrifying thought, that future generations might not be able to see the Victoria Falls in their full glory.
Yeah. Of course, when the river's actually flowing, there are few sights on Earth more inspiring and awesome than the Victoria Falls, as Marlyn evoked so vividly for us.
Well, I've been twice, in fact, to Victoria Falls, seen them. And I don't think there's anything quite in the world like it. I mean, there are other majestic waterfalls, but the sheer scale of the Zambezi falling over into the gorge, I don't think is matched anywhere in the world. For instance, the lip of the falls is over a mile long, and at the height of the floods, water is pouring over this mile-long face of the waterfall, down into a chasm where you can hardly see the bottom. It's as though it's falling into the center of the earth. And it produces, of course, this spray, which rises into the sky with a continuous rainbow and creating a tropical rainforest along the banks of the river and round the gorge, which again is an extraordinary feature because the land otherwise in that part of Africa is dry savanna bush. And then suddenly there is this tropical rainforest on the lip of the falls. It's a breathtaking sight. I don't think anyone who has seen the Victoria Falls would ever forget it and would ever see anything like it in the world. And notably, it's not just the falls themselves, but this extraordinary gorge that winds deep in the earth for miles downriver, winding in a series of hairpin bends along a geological fault, which the river has sort of cut back to the edge of the falls as they are today. It's a quite extraordinary sight.
Speaking to Marlyn, what really struck me, as with so many of our guests, was how much a formative encounter with these amazing places had inspired his, not just his life's work, but in fact his whole life direction. And clearly that was a running theme throughout the last series, that everyone we spoke to, sense of place was such a key motivator for them in what they'd done and what they had written about.
This is a great quote from On Leopard Rock, in which Wilbur says, "I've been wherever my heart has desired, and in the process my books have taken readers to many, many places." And indeed they have, because one of Wilbur's many strengths as a writer was his remarkable ability to convey a sense of place, to make it come alive, to make you feel you were actually there. And a sense of place is very, very important in historical fiction, as we learned when we asked Felicity Aston, the polar explorer, who was the first guest in this series, about what she looked for in a good adventure story.
Yeah, I was looking for a sense of place, firstly. I want to be transported to wherever the book is taking me, and I want to feel like I've really experienced that environment and been there with the characters, living through the moments with them, so that I could get that same excitement, that thrill of adrenaline by reading that story as I would if I was actually on that adventure and taking part in it. The place was really important.
Yeah. And funnily enough, when we asked Saul David a very similar question, this was his answer.
Well, I think fiction draws you in because, first and foremost, it has to be a great story. But when historical fiction is done well, as it is, of course, by Wilbur Smith, it's because you get a proper sense of place. But of course, in Wilbur's case, born in South Africa, lived there for many, many years. And of course, he can depict the place, the climates, the wildlife. You very much get a proper sense of the setting, but as well as the history.
As a travel writer, I've certainly found that you can only really give an authentic description of somewhere and make it come alive by actually going there. And certainly many of our guests found inspiration by travelling somewhere. And it seems that it was actually going to the Great Zimbabwe that sparked Joost Fonteyn's interest in the subject, and indeed it may have inspired him to become an anthropologist.
I was a student and I was working in northern Zimbabwe. I had a few months in Zimbabwe and I started traveling around, and I found myself at Great Zimbabwe and I camped at the site, and it was amazing. I was awe-inspired by the place, and then very soon I met people who lived around it and I went to stay with them. We kept contact. I was there maybe for 5 days or so originally, and then I came back as a student doing a research project in '97. I kept contact with the people who lived nearby. They were dancing in an Mbira group there. And that's a family I'm still very much in contact with, and I go to visit them often, and I stayed with them throughout my PhD and my postdoctoral research. So, I've been in and around that part of Zimbabwe. I spent 20 years, at least, working there.
And in fact, this is a theme that's going to carry on to series 2 of our podcast, because one of our upcoming guests, Bernard Freeman, who's written a book about slavery in the Muslim world, tells us that it was visiting Zanzibar that first got him interested in the Indian Ocean slave trade.
And in 1986, just really on a vacation, I traveled to Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a very popular vacation site, both for people in East Africa, all over the Indian Ocean world, and even people in Europe and Asia. It has quite a big tourist trade that comes there. And I went there as a tourist. And in Islam, most people are taught that Islam abhors slavery, that Islam has a very strong egalitarian ethic that's connected with the religion. And so most Muslims think that Islam was anti-slavery and was an anti-slavery kind of religious ideology. When I got to Zanzibar, I was confronted with this very deep, as I described it, and complex history that actually the Muslims had been involved in a very extensive and long-term slave trade in the Indian Ocean, and that Zanzibar was an entrepot of that slave trade and a center of the slave trade. And as Wilbur Smith described in in the excerpt that you read, and I was like, as an African American, I have always had an interest in slavery, and I teach civil rights and things like that. But I'd never really had any experience in doing scholarly work in American slavery, although I'm a descendant of American slaves. But when I got to Zanzibar, being a Muslim, this fascinated me, that the Zanzibar's role in the Indian Ocean slave trade. And so I began research on really two main topics. One, just the relationship between slavery and Islam or Islamic law, and then more specifically, the details with respect to slavery in East Africa and in the Indian Ocean world.
Yeah, it's funny. We've had a few scholars on the program, and it's amazing how many of them the passion is fired by a trip kind of early in their life, where being in the place is what really inspires them to take up their field of study. And I think it really speaks to the importance of place in really kind of getting hold of our imaginations, which of course Wilbur Smith understood so well. It's amazing how many people you meet in this line of work who have read a Wilbur book in particular, and that's inspired them to go to Africa or to have different adventures.
This is absolutely true. I'm a very good example of someone who knew very little about Africa until I started reading Wilbur's books. And now Africa has gone right to the top of my bucket list. And on that note, I'm extremely envious of Tom, because he did get the chance to go to Africa to make a documentary about Wilbur.
Yeah, so I went in 2020, literally a month before the COVID lockdown started happening. So I was very lucky with the timing. And it was a very odd trip in the sense that it was like visiting somewhere I'd seen in a dream or it existed inside me, even though I'd never been there before. Because obviously I'd read about all these places in Wilbur's books. And so I had a mental representation of what they would be like based on my reading of Wilbur. And then suddenly you're there in the actual physical place. And inevitably, an awful lot of it was exactly as Wilbur had described it, but in a sense, even more real. And then, of course, every so often there'd be something that had changed since the time he was writing about, and then that would be quite odd. But yeah, I started off in Cape Town, which is really sort of ground zero for the Courtenays. It's where they're always coming into Africa or jumping out of Africa. And I got to walk through the company gardens, which features in scenes in, I think, Birds of Prey and Monsoon, as well as in The Tiger's Prey. I went to Durban, which is the Nativity Bay of the Courtenay legend, where Tom Courtenay and his family settle at the end of Blue Horizon, and later on, where very close to where the Courtenays will finally settle at the Tugela Flats, which I also saw. I went into what was formerly known as Zululand, now KwaZulu-Natal, and met some Zulus. In fact, I had an encounter with a real-life Zulu prince who is actually a very long-descended relative of King Shaka, which was extraordinary, because the book I was working on at the time, it was Warrior King, which deals with the Zulus and with King Shaka. And I went all the way up into the mountains. I saw the site of the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which we talked about earlier, and indeed the site of the Battle of Isandlwana, which was indeed as evocative and eerie as Saul David described it, and ended up in the mountains where the Tugela River flows down this sort of vast 2,000-foot drop into a boulder field, and then gradually starts its long journey to the sea. So to feel that I was following in the footsteps of the Courtenays, and really this world that Wilbur had conjured in my mind was suddenly coming alive all around me, was one of the great experiences of my life.
It does sound amazing. Somehow I must find my way there too.
Well, I'm hoping we're going to take our podcast on the road and do some live episodes.
From the top of Table Mountain, perhaps?
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's pretty much wrapped up our look back on the last series. But I think everyone should know that we've got some quite interesting things coming up in this series too. To begin with, our podcast next time will be with Professor Bernard Freeman, who we've already mentioned, and he will be talking about the Indian Ocean slave trade. And we've also got a great episode about the East India Company with Professor David Howarth, who's written a wonderful book called Adventurers, The Improbable Rise of the East India Company. And we're certainly hoping to have a guest to tell us about Shaka, King Shaka.
In fact, the novel I was researching on my trip to South Africa is going to be published this spring in May, titled Warrior King.
And is that about Shaka?
It is all about Shaka. He is the titular warrior king, the eponymous king.
And then we're going to have more on the Atlantic slave trade as depicted in Call of the Raven. We're going to talk about the Siege of Khartoum from the Triumph of the Sun. And hopefully an episode on the River Nile, the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. So I hope you will join us for those. And do please comment on social media about anything in the podcast you particularly enjoyed, or not enjoyed, or learned, or would like to know more about. We'd love to hear from you, so do let us know what you think of the podcast so that we can try and make it better. And from time to time, Tom and I will read out some of your comments, at least the more broadcastable ones.
And equally, if you have any questions for us or ideas for topics you'd like us to discuss, again, let us know and we will do our best to answer them.
Well, on that positive note, we've come to the end of the episode, which I hope you've enjoyed. So it's goodbye from me, Christopher Wynne.
And goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer, Niso Smith.